and welcome once again to the TooFatLardies Advent Calendar for 2021. Today we will be opening door number 11 on our Advent Calendar. Now, Christmas is a magical time when St. Nicholas or Father Christmas or Santa Claus or whatever character name you may choose manages to navigate the world in record speed and deliver presents to all the children who have been good. He does this, of course, using a movement rate that will be well beyond most war games rules. Movement, of course, like this can be inspirational. And Richard now is going to tell us what it is that inspires him to think that movement in war games isn't always 6 inches.
Variable movement is something that's appeared in every set of Lardy rules in the last 20 years, and very much core to our view of what happens in the reality of, not just a combat situation, but really any journey going from A to B can experience friction that makes things happen at a different rate to the one that we anticipated. Which I guess is why these days we all have sat-navs on our phones and whatever that tell us our ETA, because it is such a variable outcome. The precise mechanisms have varied slightly. So in Shot Mum, for example, gave each unit action dice and you'd spend them on whatever you wanted to. So if you had 3 action dice and you used 2 for firing, you'd roll 2d6 on the fire table, and then if you wanted to move with the remaining dice, you'd roll that 1 dice, and that's how far you went. In inches, obviously you might decide to use 2d6 to move first and then just use the 1d6 to fire afterwards, or stand still, fire with 3d6, or just move with 3d6. Now, the action dice allowed the player to decide how they wanted to spend their dice, and it was a pretty clean and intuitive mechanism. You could use them in any order, so it got rid of the idea that you had a movement phase and then a firing phase, which is always something that I felt was a bit of an artificial limitation. It allowed you to do these things in whatever order you wanted. Going forward, we've continued to use a variable movement system, as we like the result it gives. It's not random. If you're rolling 2d6, you'll be really unlucky to go 2 inches, or really lucky to go 12 inches. You can, like a real person, or presumably you are a real person, but your 28 mil or 15 mil or whatever mil oppo on the tabletop can make a rough calculation of whether you're likely to run across that road before the enemy opens up. Of course, what we like best is the fact that whilst it's predictable, there are no guarantees. And as a game designer, and also as somebody who enjoys studying history, that's got real appeal, as it obliges the players to make decisions based on imperfect information. I mean, that's a real life command experience, and it translates perfectly into a game which is focusing on exactly that type of decision. So if I'm a platoon commander in Normandy, I can send off one of my sections to set up a base of fire on a ridge. What I cannot do is know how long it will take them to get there. Ground conditions are infinitely variable, and you just never know how long troops will take to complete such a march, especially when they're out of your line of sight. And also that adds the point that if you're a platoon commander and you desperately need to get them around there, you probably want to send your platoon sergeant with them to make sure that he encourages them to achieve it in a timely fashion. Now, these are all pretty obvious military tenets. Indeed, I think that variable movement is so obvious that it does make you wonder how on earth we came to adopt the predictable 6-inch standard move as the hobby norm, or indeed any fixed rates of movement. There are so clearly a case that they are providing the player with a certainty that in reality they would just never have. Imagine if Wellington had known precisely that when Blucher was going to turn up at Waterloo. Imagine knowing from the outset of a game, and this is possibly even worse in a way, that your lead brigade could definitely get to that bridge before the enemy just because you are X amount of inches closer. That's an utterly artificial degree of knowledge, and predictable, that means the commander is not faced with the uncertainty that they would be faced with in reality. They would hope that they would get there first, but they couldn't possibly know it. Now, normally when you ask me for what inspirations we've had for mechanisms, I'll quote books and historical examples, but the greatest inspiration for me actually was a personal one when I was just 16, just a few years ago, and I was on an endurance and map reading exercise. I was leading a small group. We completed about 20 kilometres of 25-kilometre march, and we crested a ridge. I checked the map, and I could see that we were about 300 metres out from where we should have been, which actually in relatively featureless terrain was not bad, and we could certainly have adjusted that. Had we been where we'd meant to have been, we would have linked up with a crescent-shaped track that gradually descended right round the edge of a broad valley for about 3 kilometres down to near our final rendezvous point. But we were hot and we were tired, and the slope below us was covered in what looked like newly planted small trees, acres and acres and acres of them. And it struck me that rather than move 300 metres to the right and then join up with this track that then went on this huge crescent shape around the edge of the valley, that if we simply went straight through the trees, that rather than making this circuitous sort of 3 kilometre plus journey by the track, we could stroll for about, I think it was about 1.5 kilometres through shady trees on a very easy stroll down a gentle slope, which looked absolutely the sensible thing to do. And I made that suggestion, and I think everybody agreed with me because we were all knackered, and we rather naively set off. Well, the first thing we discovered that the trees weren't quite as small as we thought they were, but we'd gone down into a bowl, and the track had been running round the top lip of that bowl, so we were down into this bowl with these higher trees. Now that did allow some element of shade, but what we then discovered that there was some kind of irrigation system. Now, looking back, I think the national parks people must have planted the trees to stop the erosion of the ground where the slope ran down, and that the roots of the trees were holding everything in place. Now, what they were there for was between each row of trees there was a gully. It was quite narrow. It was only about maybe 3 foot across, but it was also 3 foot deep. So what we found ourselves doing was going down this hill through these, having to clamber over these gullies all the way down. And after about 400 metres, the gullies were not getting easier. In fact, they were getting to a point where about 4.5 foot deep. And with, carrying a fair amount of weight as we were doing at the time, it was getting deeper and deeper and harder. And in the end, this, what should have been a nice easy stroll over about 1.5 kilometres, meant that we had to retrace our steps all the way back. And it took us much longer to do that, 400 kilometres each way through the plantation, than it did to then relocate 300 metres onto the track and then simply stroll down the 3 kilometres of that gentle slope. It was a very, very harsh lesson, and one that I always think back to in terms of considering how what appears to be easy can actually very easily become the impossible. And over the years, I found that whilst I've never had an experience quite that extreme again, I have found that when I've gone off the piste, taking the dog for a walk and decided to take a shortcut through what looks like easier terrain, that it always takes longer than you think, and it's never as easy as you thought it would be. So I think we can all pick examples from our own life when just simply making journeys without the stress of people shooting at you or doing anything else unpleasant, and know that variable movement is a mechanism that we use for a good reason.